Welcome back. This is it. This is week 6, lecture 2, the last lecture of the course. Hereafter, all you have is the final exam, which I'll be talking about later today. The title for this lecture, this wrapping up lecture, is The End of Toleration, the Impact of the Reformation. I ended last lecture with discussion of the end of Christendom. Now we need to look at what happens. And the whole focus of this course, as I said at the beginning, is dealing with historical change, what affects it, what brings it about, whereby Europe in 1300 is very different than Europe in 1600. What happens? What causes that change? And your final exam is getting at that because it's asking how do we describe what went on during this period, these 300 years. But here, too, I want to look a bit further, not only kind of looking back at the period 1300 to 1600, but then, too, looking at kind of pointing forward in terms of the effects of these changes. Now, of course, I could take that all through into another course in some ways, early modern Europe until our contemporary times, because the Reformation did impact everything that happened thereafter within Europe and still is with us today. But I hope in this lecture to kind of give a broader perspective, a Rückblick, as they say in German, a looking back, as well as a looking forward. And how did this all take place? And one of the major aspects that was part of this transformation was confessionalization. Now, confessionalization is something that I talked about briefly earlier on, and then again more recently, in that it is a process that came after religionization. Now, I've talked about these three processes: Christianization, religionization, and then confessionalization. Confessionalization, as the slide says, I give the definition there, is the process or processes by which a particular religious confession was enforced within a given political entity as a means of territorial state building. Now, what that is getting at is, this just begins kind of with the Confession of Augsburg. If you go back to 1530, that aspect of the evangelical princes and states at the Diet of Augsburg presenting, at least for the Lutheran aspect, their confession of faith, saying this is where we stand and this is what we think is the truth, and this is kind of, we're drawing the line here. And the Diet rejects it. But then from that point on, becoming Protestant, joining the Reformation, introducing the Reformation, was equated with accepting and implementing the Confession of Augsburg. Now, also, I talked about the Confession of the Four Cities, the same thing there. And we have various confessional texts. These are all texts. And with the Catholic tradition and the Counter-Reformation, we can say that the canons of the Council of Trent function as a confessional document. They set the Catholic practice until Vatican II. The Confession of Augsburg is still the basis of the Lutheran traditions today. So the point is that this new development was of major importance because there was no such thing before. Because with this movement process of confessionalization is increased state control. And that's where we get the end of toleration. We have theology and politics. It's not the beginning of the separation of church and state, which I've tried to stress throughout. It is saying that theology must be backed politically. Now, in some ways, we can go all the way back and say this began with Theodosius, Roman emperor who proclaimed Christianity the only legal religion of Rome, whereby it was illegal not to be a Christian. So that if you were not a Christian, it was a crime against the state. That concept continued throughout medieval Christendom. I talked about the origins and development of medieval Christendom. And through the Christianization process, which again, the Christianization process is not my term. Confessionalization is not my term. Religionization is. But once, as I said, around the year 1000, when Europe was Christian, except for the Jews, by and large, being a Christian just meant being baptized and attending Christian worship. Then there was this broad movement and developing movement of now that we're Christian, what does that mean and how do we live a Christian life? That's what I refer to as religionization in the broad sense. We find a spreading of micro-religions. Now, this is a sociological concept because, as I've said before, at the time, Christianity for people in Europe was not a religion, it was a faith. And religion was how you fulfilled your obligations to that faith, that belief. So there were many different religions within Christianity. And we see developing through the High and later Middle Ages the proliferation of particular religious groups organized around the endeavor to fulfill their religious obligation, which was incumbent upon all, as a special way to do so in terms of meeting your obligation to God. That continues. And then, beginning in approximately 1530, and really picking up after the mid-16th century, after the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, where there was, okay, we're going to stop trying to achieve unity, and we will acknowledge that there are two distinct religious confessions within the empire, within the state, so to speak. That had never happened before. There had been diversity. Oh, yeah. Heretical groups, this, that, and everywhere. But the official recognition of two different religious confessions within a single political entity was a new development. Now, as I said before, when I was talking about the Peace of Augsburg and the aftermath, this was not toleration, because the individual territories that comprised the empire could either be Lutheran or Catholic. No other options. And the leaders, the princes or the city councils, determined what religious confession they were going to be. So if you're a prince, I know I've already said this, but it bears repeating. If you were a prince within the empire, if you were, the Duke of Bavaria or something, or the King of Bavaria, King of Bohemia, you could say, my territory is Catholic. And therefore, if you're not Catholic, you have to move. Or if you were the Count Palatine, you could say, my territory is now going to be Lutheran or evangelical. And so if you're Catholic, you have to move. Now, with this sense, going back to the concept of if I'm a prince, I'm responsible for my subjects' spiritual as well as physical well-being, and I will have to answer to God for that. You want to make sure that there is conformity within your territory. You cannot allow heresy. And so also means of seeking out deviance increased. Both in Protestant and in Catholic territories. We don't have the founding of the Roman Inquisition until the mid-16th century. The Index of Prohibited Books in the 16th century. The Roman Catechism in the 16th century. We already have Luther's Catechism in 1529. On we go. But the bureaucratic development of the state apparatus, so to speak, started infiltrating local levels. The opposite of toleration, whereby Europe in 1400 or even in 1500 was far more tolerant than it was in 1600. Because in 1500, there was the overarching understanding that we're all part of the same thing, and determinations of what would be particularly allowed were not nearly as defined as they started becoming during the course of the 16th century. So that, theology and politics is not a separation of the two, but a further entrenching of the two, whereby within every territory there needed to be conformity. And we needed to be sure that that was there. Now, with I should talk about the increased bureaucratization of the state, that goes back to the visitations. Because as I talked about with Luther, what led to his catechism was the visitations, to go out into the parishes to see what's going on. What do other people know? Are they learning anything? And he was shocked to find out that in his view, they really weren't. So what do we do about it? We have to institute policies to make sure that the message is getting out and that conformity is there. So what we see is from monastic visitations to Lutheran visitations to finally then attempt to control what's going on by the state, bureaucratic visitations, so to speak. And even already early on, Erasmus said, what is a city but a great monastery? And if you view it in that way, that a city or a state is a great monastery, in the medieval tradition, monasteries were very regulated. They were not a place for toleration. There was individuality, yes. There could be diversities of opinion, yes, but you had to conform. And when we take that model and apply it to the entire political territory or political entity, whatever that might be, then indeed the political entity becomes one great monastery. But that necessitates a decrease in toleration. Because not everybody was supposed to live as a monastic in the Middle Ages. You didn't have to be. That was what, you signed up to be. That was one possible religion or one possible official, legally defined state of being a religious that would work. But you could still be a Christian. But now all of a sudden, you have to conform to the same kind of standards as a monastic view, but within the entire territory. And that's going a bit too, that's it's not exactly a one-to-one correlation, but the concept is kind of there. The idea behind it is kind of there, that we need to make sure that everybody is following the rules, like the monastic rule. Now it's the rule of the Confession of Augsburg, if you're Lutheran, or eventually the Creed of the Council of Trent. We need to make sure that we see this on the local level. So this concept of bureaucratization for control starts in the later medieval period with monastic visitations of the Augustinians, the Franciscans, the Dominicans. They all had them, Benedictines too. And then becomes applied to the political entity of the state or the territory. That is then leads to a loss of individual freedom and an increase in the functions of the state. Now, we've seen throughout that there's been always was this tension throughout medieval Christendom between who was really in charge. Was it the emperor or was it the pope? There's always conflict. Two different models. For the emperor, Christendom was a state. No, it was a church. It was a state church. Sorry, it was a state church. The church, the clergy, was to serve the state. For the pope, it was the opposite. It was a church state, whereby the state was to serve the church. In the course of the 16th century, we can see that the imperial position won out, even in Catholic territories. Because to enforce religious conformity within Catholic territories, the state is the apparatus to do so. This whole process of confessionalization leads to the increased bureaucracy, extension of control of the state. It's not doing away with theology. It's just saying that the theology is becoming underneath state control. And in Germany, I believe it's still the case. At least it was when I was there. Haven't been there for a while, but when I was living there, that the clergy are state bureaucrats, which for Americans, it's like, what? What do you mean? They are public employees of the state. That's hard for Americans to grasp. But that is a result of confessionalization. Now, if we move on from confessionalization, we have then, by definition almost, the crumbling of Christendom, as I talked about again at the end of last lecture. But then what replaced Christendom? I talked early on about the myth of Christendom and how Christendom is almost like this operating system. I'm not a computer person, so this may not work, but I think this sort of in a very broad general sense works. Christendom for the Middle Ages was Windows. And within Windows, we have all these different programs, so that was what was going on. But when that operating program, when Windows crumbles, what do we replace it with? That was what was going on in the course of the 16th century. And what emerged was what I call the myth of the nation state. Now, why do I say a myth of the nation state? For the same reason I talk about the myth of Christendom. Because there was no such thing as Christendom. It was an idea, a concept, an assumption of this religio-theological political entity defined by the bounds of Christian worship. With the myth of the state, there's no such thing as a state. You say, what are you talking about, Professor Sack? Of course there's a thing as a state. We live in the United States. It's a state. States go to war. States are all over here. Show me the United States. It's an idea. You can show me the government. You can show me the White House. You can show me the Capitol building. You can show me the Constitution, a text, kind of a confessional document. Supposedly. Has been. We'll see how long it lasts. You can point to individuals. You can point to the physical geographical territories and the cartographic boundaries of states, meaning on the map. But show me the United States of America. You say, well, here's a flag. Yeah, that's a flag. That symbolizes this concept, this idea. But the same for every state. Germany does not exist. Now, Germany became unified in 1871. Oh, there we go, Bismarck. Italy became, unified about the same time. France and England were already unified. A state is a concept. To say that it doesn't exist does not mean it does not have enormous impact. That's the issue of myth. Myth, as I've used it in this course, and I use it in all my courses, is not the opposite of true or real, even though that's the general understanding of it. It's not a fable, it's not a fairy tale. It is, as I think I've mentioned before, or if I haven't, I should have, it's a mythopoetic truth that is real and has huge impact on people. And the myth of Christendom the myth of the nation state became the new operating system, replacing the myth of Christendom. Now, that's an interpretation. Of course it is. That's my interpretation based on my study and everything else. But in some ways, that's what we do as historians. We have to come up with some way of understanding these diverse developments, diverse artifacts that are still present, because if an artifact is not present, if it's lost, if it's disappeared, we can't analyze it to learn about the past, because the past does not exist. We cannot study the past. We can only study what is in the present and the artifacts that exist in the present that signify that which no longer exists. That's why the documents are so important. The reading of the documents, the primary sources, which I don't like that term, are so important because they're the only access we have to that which no longer exists. And so as historians, we have to construct some way of understanding. Periodization itself is part of that. What demarcates the Middle Ages from early modern Europe? It all depends on whom you ask in some ways. If we're looking at social structures, legal structures, we can say the Middle Ages lasts until the French Revolution. If we're looking at intellectual structures, we could say it lasts until, the quote-unquote scientific revolution. Ecclesiastical structures, theological structures, we can say it lasts until the Reformation. So it all kind of depends on what we're looking at and how to understand the multiplicity of disparate evidence that we're confronted with. So we tell our stories, and we learn our stories, and we take our stories as that which actually happened. That's our starting point. There's a lot of unlearning that has to be done to become an historian. And part of that is that the past does not exist. Well, the only thing that exists are the sources, the documents, the primary evidence, archaeological too, etc., geographical, all kinds of different types of evidence that exists in the present that we can actually examine and ask ourselves, what does this mean? That's what this is all getting at. Because when we start to use terms to describe what we observe, we are attributing meaning to that. Luther's 95 Theses, in and of themselves, don't mean a thing. They're just markings on a page until people read them, until they were read. Now they meant something to Luther. He's no longer around. How do we know what they meant to Luther? That's the trick. That's the question. What did they mean to other people? That's the trick at the time. That's the trick. That's the question. And do we ascribe our own meaning to it? Or as historians, do we try to discern the meaning that was described to these artifacts that still exist at the time when they came into existence? That's what we're looking at. We're not talking about the meaning I give to it. That's the theological understanding or the philosophical understanding of history. What we want to try to get at is how did the people at the time understand what they were doing and the importance and significance of it, and why did they do what they were doing, what they did? What made that possible? And with that understanding, the 16th century changed everything. And here I have, I think, on the slide here, in the Myth of the Nation State, a bit forward-looking. So this is all dealing with developments after this course, and so they're not part of the exam, but you can bring them in if you would like. We have the 30 Years' War in the Empire, which has been called the First World War in many ways, from 1618 to 1648. Which in some ways, this is a simplistic view of it, was because the Peace of Augsburg in 1555 did not include the Calvinists. And there were beginning to be Calvinists within the empire. The two wanted their religious rights. And so at the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, the end of the 30 Years' War, it opened up the permissible religious confessions within the empire to Calvinism. Again, an opening up and a diversification, which is still not toleration. The 30 Years' War has also been said to be the last war of religion. That's questionable. So it started out as a war of religion and ended up as a war of states. But that's what we're getting towards. Again, more war. Did the Reformation bring peace and toleration and individuality? Not at all. Quite the opposite. And then we go to France. If we look at France, English absolutism up there a second. Sorry. Because in England, I know I have not lectured on the Reformation in England. I leave that for the textbook. It's a fantastic story in and of itself. I think I've referred to it now and then, but I haven't given a particular lecture on the Reformation in England. But with the Elizabethan Compromise, which I'm assuming you know based on the assigned reading in Lindbergh, settling the religious question in England. That really didn't settle things because we had the English Civil War coming up. Just more or less about the same time as the 30 Years' War, or right after the 30 Years' War, because like 1649 to 1653 or something like that. And this was a clash of religion because, as you know from reading Lindbergh about the English Reformation, we have Henry VIII, who issued the Act of Supremacy, or not he didn't, but Parliament did under his leadership in 1534, breaking from Rome. But the Henrician Church was more or less the same as it had always been. But then Henry's son Edward, who comes to the throne upon his father's death, was raised by Calvinists. And he moves the church far more towards the Calvinist direction. He dies early. And then Henry's first child, Mary Tudor, takes over. She became known as Bloody Mary, and returns England to Catholicism. And then she dies relatively early. And then Elizabeth comes with, what do we do about this? The Calvinist faction was not happy with Elizabeth. They felt that the Church of England, which they could accept the Church of England, but it should be far more Calvinistic. It should be more like Edward, not like Elizabeth. And Elizabeth was not saying we go back to my father Henry. She too was somewhat in between, but still, it was like, okay, we still need to purify the church. And that faction of Calvinists, or Presbyterians, because that was the form of government, and presbyter in Latin is simply priest. But the Presbyterian faction became those arguing for the absolute urgent need to purify the Church of England. They became therefore known as the Puritans. And they're the ones that came to this new world after the Civil War. And that also then led Thomas Hobbes in the